Apple is doomed. That's a bold claim, isn't it? And I guess after this video, even if the channel does well, we are never getting an invite for the iPhone event. Oh well. But how does a company sitting on nearly 200 billion in cash, dominating smartphone markets, and wearing the crown as the world's first $3 trillion company in trouble? Well, Rome wasn't built in a day, but it sure burned down in one. And just like BlackBerry in the early 2000s, stubbornness and lack of innovation can be a problem. In this video, we're going to show you that there are some major cracks within Apple's empire. Let's unpack the research, lawsuits, numbers, and warning signs to understand why Apple might actually be in serious trouble. This is the one that people who hate Apple love to talk about, and rightly so. That is the lack of innovation coming from Cupertino. I remember when Apple launched their first iPhone.
And we are calling it iPhone.
It changed everything, and I truly do mean that, as I personally lived through that time. I remember I was in high school. I saw everyone was gathered around the iMac in the library. I went over and asked, "What are you guys doing?" And everyone was staring, giggling, and going crazy for, at the time, this impossible device. A device that lets you pinch to zoom into photos like we were living in an episode of CSI.
Can you zoom in on that?
And had your iTunes library in the phone, so you never needed to carry around an iPod. For context, if you didn't live in that time, all we had was a small screen and a keyboard. And I'm gonna sound like Mr. Mobile here, but I would go back to that time in a heartbeat. A little after that, touchscreens became the standard, killing BlackBerry, a $70 billion company, along other rivals. App stores became gold mines, and Apple, it changed from a cult into a religion. I'm not going to bore you with all the stats because that's not really what this is all about, but everyone knows they made a ton of money in that time and they're now worth over $3 trillion. But what about today? Every September, Apple unveils a new iPhone, and every year the upgrades are, let's be honest, meh. You get, what, a slightly better camera, a new titanium shell now, and maybe a chip that saves 5% more battery. Yay. Oh, and AI. Don't forget about AI. People love AI. What happened to the excitement? What happened to the innovation? And don't give me the argument that phones have saturated and they can't get any better. If you truly believe that, you haven't seen what Huawei and Honor have to offer. And don't get me started on the better cameras. I have to say that's mostly a lie, as the sensor size has barely ever changed. Anyone who knows anything about cameras knows that the sensor size is the most important part of the camera. All the enhancements were made by how Apple processes the photo, which is not innovation, but it's great marketing. Academic studies from scholars argue that monopolistic companies tend to innovate less, not more. Because when you control the market, why risk changing it? That's the problem. Apple's dominance might be the very reason it's becoming predictable. And I remember another company that was in a similar stance and had the most market share and became predictable. Unfortunately, BlackBerry doesn't exist anymore. But you're gonna say, all right, what about the Vision Pro? Isn't that innovation? And yeah, the Vision Pro is very cool, and I can personally say that it's amazing. However, it's also a ton of money. Demand for the Vision Pro was falling off a cliff just 1 month after its launch. According to a report by TF International Securities analyst Ming-Chi Kuo, the expert revealed that Apple has cut its sales forecasts by as much as 50%, expected to sell between 400 and 450,000 units instead of the 800,000 units that were previously projected. Not only that, resale value has also plummeted. And here's a stat that should make any Apple enthusiast nervous. More than 50% of Apple's revenue comes directly from the iPhone. That means Apple's entire business model is like a skyscraper balanced on one pillar. If that pillar cracks, everything else shakes. And cracks are forming. People believe the smartphone market is saturated because they're keeping their phones longer. Why upgrade if there's nothing to upgrade to? And Android phones are catching up, and sometimes surpassing with features at just half the price. Just wait for our S25 Ultra review, where we tell you the S25 is the better iPhone. In the first 3 months of 2024, Apple fell by more than 10% year on year to 46 billion, in contrast to the wider smartphone market, which enjoyed a 10% increase in shipments. Apple's share of new smartphone activations has dropped to a 6-year low in the United States. And after briefly overtaking Samsung as the world's #1 smartphone maker at the end of 2023, it's fallen back to second position in 2024. Apple officially dropped out of the top 5 smartphone sellers in China in the second quarter. Look, the iPhone isn't going anywhere anytime soon, but it might not be enough to keep Apple on top for much longer. However, I want to be honest here. The only reason that Apple and even Samsung are currently surviving right now is because of the ban of Huawei and Honor. Right now, the Chinese manufacturers are light years ahead of Samsung and Apple. So much so that Samsung's CEO officially apologized for the lack of innovation. Apple, on the other hand, spits in your face and tells you it's rain. And I'm not being overly dramatic. Remember when the iPhone had a problem with its antenna and they told you that you were holding the phone wrong? Yeah, I remember that. Now let's talk about the elephant in the courtroom. In March 2024, the US Department of Justice, along with more than 15 states, filed a landmark antitrust lawsuit against Apple. Their accusation? Apple had created an illegal smartphone monopoly by using its closed ecosystem to suppress rivals, block third-party digital wallets, and punish users that try to leave Apple's world. The DOJ says Apple's practices undermine innovation, stifle competition, and impose unnecessary costs on developers, businesses, and their users. This wasn't just in the United States. The EU has officially ordered Apple by antitrust regulators to open its closed ecosystem up to rivals. These lawsuits were in Germany as well. And guess what? In Germany, they lost. Then they appealed, and then they lost again. Apple then agreed to open its tap-and-go mobile systems to rivals to settle EU antitrust concerns. The EU has also filed another antitrust lawsuit against Apple, and they expect a ruling in the next couple of weeks. In 2022, Google paid Apple $20 billion just to remain the default search engine in Safari. That's not competition, that's a toll booth on the internet. If this lawsuit gains traction, Apple could be forced to open its ecosystem in the United States, eroding one of its most profitable advantages. I'll be honest with you, at the rate of innovation from competitors, if Apple loses their ecosystem, they would be in major trouble. Now, Apple's supply chain is a masterpiece of modern capitalism and a ticking time bomb that may have just detonated. 90% of iPhones are assembled in China. Rising tensions between the US and China could throw a huge wrench in that relationship. If you've been watching the news, let's recap what's happened this week. The United States has implemented a 125% tariff against China. But here's what the latest reporting and expert analysis reveals about the potential impact of the tariffs on Chinese goods, specifically on Apple, whose iPhone production is still overwhelmingly based in China. According to Reuters, the new proposed Trump-era tariffs, ranging from 54 to 109 to now 125% on certain Chinese goods, would affect Apple directly, since over 90% of its iPhones are assembled in China. If Apple were to pass the full cost onto consumers, the price of an iPhone could soar to over $2,300 USD, and that's just for a regular iPhone. Apple's trying to make a foldable phone that was supposed to be over $3,000 USD, and if tariffs are in place, it could push that to over $5,000. Apple has a tough choice: absorb the extra expense or pass it on to its consumers. Not only that, the disruption to the global supply chain would cause an issue. Apple's intricate supply chain is deeply embedded in China. Assembly by Foxconn and components are sourced locally. Logistic pipelines finely tuned for scale. Tariffs threaten this entire system. A sudden shift would disrupt timelines, increase lead times, and raise operational costs dramatically. Now, to be fair, Apple has been working to reduce its dependence on China with a $6 billion investment into expanding iPhone production in India, as reported by Bloomberg and TechCrunch. However, India currently produces less than 15% of global iPhone output. Quality control, labor skills, and logistics in India are still not as mature as China. So while Apple is trying to pivot, it can't do it fast enough to dodge the immediate tariff impact. Apple has been so worried about the impact of these tariffs, they are flying plane loads of products every single day, and stock impact has already been felt. The mere announcement of new tariff plans sent Apple stock tumbling nearly 10%, marking the worst day since March 2020. If Apple raises iPhone prices to cover tariff burden, it risks reduced demand, especially in price-sensitive markets, shrinking upgrade cycles as people hold on to older devices, competitive losses, particularly to lower-priced Android rivals. 125% tariffs on Chinese goods could seriously destabilize Apple's finely tuned production machine. With most of its devices still built in China, Apple faces a no-win situation. Eat the costs, crush the margins, or pass the cost to customers and kill the demand. Despite its efforts to shift to India and Vietnam, the scale, speed, and cost efficiency of China can't be replicated overnight. Apple could be forced into an emergency restructuring of its global operations, a process that's risky, expensive, and time-consuming. And if you're wondering, won't everyone be affected by this? Actually, Samsung is in an amazing position as they are currently working on a deal with the United States. And the United States has paused all tariffs with every other country so deals can be worked out. Most likely, Samsung will come out of this in a much better position than Apple, but only time will tell. Now let's talk about Apple's failures. This is a big one, as it never really gets talked about and it gets swept under the rug. Remember how Apple was supposed to build an electric car that would knock Tesla off its pedestal? You know, the thing that they invested more than $10 billion into, a decade-long project? Well, yeah, that's canceled. Why was it canceled? Well, because Project Titan was plagued with internal disagreements from the get-go that hampered all progress. And literally days after the Apple Car or iCar was canceled, Apple quietly abandoned the project to develop micro-LED displays for the Apple Watch and the iPhone. Once again, they invested billions of dollars into this idea, and it was supposed to be vastly superior to the OLED display currently on their devices. Apparently, it was too expensive and complex for Apple. Talking about the Apple Watch, Apple wearable sales are in trouble. A new report shows that shipment of Apple wearables nosedived by 18%. Although global shipments of devices grew by 8% overall, Apple's competitors, including China's Huawei, saw shipments increase by 43% and 72%. All these metrics basically show Apple is barely holding steady while all their other competitors gain ground. Also, remember Apple Intelligence? We can definitely call it a failure. It did not launch with the iPhone 16, and recently when it did launch, it was a mess. Just listen to what Gruber has to say about it. The fiasco here is not that Apple is late on AI. It's also not that they had to announce an embarrassing delay on promised features last week. Those are problems, not fiascos. And problems happen, they're inevitable. Leaders prove their mettle and create legacies, not by how they deal with successes, but by how they deal with failures. Apple used to be a company that if they said something, they meant it, and they were given a pass because they allowed Samsung and other companies in the past to innovate while they sat back and perfected it. Once again, that's no longer the case. Samsung has become a modern version of Apple, and apart from their terrible customer service and their problems with updates, Samsung, in terms of just regarding their phones, would be a better Apple. In fact, their designs of their phones are now better than Apple, which is crazy. Apple's historic strength was vision, and now it looks like they're waiting for someone else to lead. In the world of generative AI, waiting might be fatal. Apple has also been very proud of its services growth. iCloud, Music, TV+, the App Store. But guess what? Those services can only grow if the iPhone ecosystem grows. No new iPhone users, no new subscriptions, no new App Store fees. So again, we're back to the iPhone dependency problem. In the words of Gruber, Tim Cook should have already held a meeting to address and rectify Siri and the Apple Intelligence debacle. If a meeting hasn't occurred yet, or doesn't happen soon, then I fear that's all she wrote. The ride is over. When mediocrity, bullshit, and excuses take root, they take over. A culture of excellence, accountability, and integrity cannot abide by the acceptance of those things, and will quickly collapse upon itself with the acceptance of all three. Look, from the tariffs alone, Apple could be in serious trouble. If they are able to reestablish themselves in a different country, that would be great. It would give them time to innovate. However, in that time, you never know if another company could just come along and build a better Rome. Thanks for watching, everyone. We hope you liked the video. And yeah, we'll see you on the next one.